fill-ins are back. Welcome back, everybody, to By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. I am one of your regular hosts, Rich Ham. I'm the CEO of Fine Tune. At my left in the studio here today is Art of Procurement founder Phil Ideson. Phil, nice to see you.
Likewise, Rich. You've got a really good kind of movie kind of voice going on there, like we're about to have a trailer. So I like it. It's a good voice for radio.
I also think I could be, next on ESPN or something like that. But dear listeners, you'll be delighted to know that we're also joined today, as we always are on these fill-ins episodes, by Kelly Barner, Phil's partner in crime and partner in fighting crime at the Art of Procurement. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, guys. And I will just add, since this is what we're talking about, if the sports thing or the movie promo thing doesn't work out, I also think you could potentially do one of those overnight radio stations where the people talk about seeing UFOs. That's the pace, that's the depth of tone, right?
That feels
Lights
a little
in the
seedy.
sky, pilot reports.
I always thought maybe Spanish educational videos or something like that, where I could say something along the lines of "En Pamplona hay corre de los toros," something along those lines. Anyway, look.
As long as I don't have to answer questions in Spanish, go for it.
You got to have backup plans, and I'm not at all convinced that "I" was the right term there. But anyway, let's move it along with the fill-ins. Listeners, if you've been following along, we are coming out of a 3-episode sequence that really found our series, I think, hitting its stride and getting into the meat and substance of some of the issues that we've been talking about. If we can back up just a few episodes, we spoke with Thomas Udesen, the Chief Procurement Officer from Bayer. And first of all, what a great privilege it was to welcome Thomas to the project. He had so much insight and wisdom to share, not only on his work and the work that so many others that have joined him are doing in global decarbonization and the work that corporate procurement is doing in supply chain decarbonization, but also just on the challenges of running a large procurement enterprise for a global 200 organization. And some of the takeaways from that conversation were so fascinating to me. You would never think, for example, that a global 200 drug makers procurement organization would be an organization that was stripping away rules and barriers to kind of unshackle its people to just do good work. But that is, in fact, what Thomas has done in Bayer's organization. And I think we'll get into some of the most interesting nuggets that he shared with us in that episode. And then what a fascinating juxtaposition it was that we went from that episode into the following episode with Kristine Morton, who has worked in procurement for 15 years and has found herself working in perhaps the most P&L focused of all possible sorts of enterprise. She currently serves a community of franchise owners. In her past, she had worked in a small family-owned meats business, and prior to that, she had worked at a small to mid-sized private equity-backed restaurant group. And Kristine said to us, well, of course I validate that my work is manifesting in the P&L. How else would I know my stakeholders are getting the value? How else would I know that it worked, that the work that I put in was actually bearing fruit? And that, of course, was kind of singing our tune. We were kind of bringing a common sense approach, we think, to this challenge that we're tackling with this project. And it was really refreshing to hear Kristine's take that there are, in fact, environments out there that are doing the work in a way that we think is functional. From there, of course, the challenge is doing that at scale across large organizations. And in our last episode, we welcomed Jason Busch, who is, what isn't Jason Busch is a good question. He's a thought leader in certainly procurement and procurement technology, among the world's foremost in the field. He's working on an AI startup right now called Gain. He is a stream of fascinating thoughts on everything from economics to politics and social matters to corporate procurement. But on the germane question of how is AI and technology going to enable procurement to function better, and how will AI and technology play a role in enabling the sorts of complex validation of procurement's efforts, such that we can tie the efforts out to the P&L better than we have been doing in the recent past. Jason brought, I think, some encouraging answers as to the role that AI can play going forward, so that in a role that makes the seemingly challenging and complex solutions that we intend to put forward in this project actually doable, that we think it might actually... He both underscored, I would say, the urgency to act now, but also the belief that the solutions were attainable with the use of emerging technology and AI. Kelly, I want to start with you. As you think back on that 3-episode run that led us into this fill-ins conversation, what are your biggest reactions?
I think the biggest thing for me is that the thread that connects all three of them, because they're very different, right? You gave an intro to each of those. They have different backgrounds. They have different current experiences. But there's a very clear thread of common sense that connects all 3 episodes, right? With Thomas Udesen, I think the thought that jumps out to me most strongly is that it wasn't just about let's stop doing it this inefficient way, but they had an alternative proposal ready for how they were going to manage procurement activity. I think the thing about Kristine that I thought was so funny is that she talks about initially getting into this role in procurement and finding out how it works and thinking to herself, well, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we do it that way? Right? A very common sense approach to, if you don't have management authority over the people that you're trying to motivate, it has to make sense. You have to do it another way. And of course, with Jason Busch, very simply looking at some of the challenges that we face today, but also the opportunities being introduced by more real-time data, improved technology, greater automation, and saying, okay, let's make sure we're not self-limiting based on any of these things that have just been around for so long we've stopped seeing them. Right? Let's challenge everything. Again, to me, it's very strategic, but it is a common sense approach to rethinking what maybe our current limitations are and how to best move forward from here.
I think from what was interesting from my perspective was, we kind of deliberately built this so that we would have the perspective of a CPO that's working in a large organization versus a perspective of a CPO that's working in a smaller organization, because while they both work in procurement, there's obviously very different contexts and availability of resources and all those things that kind of go behind how you run a team in those different use cases. What has come from all of those conversations is around how we measure savings today as a problem. And so what did Thomas at Bayer do about that? They got rid of savings. They said, you know what, savings is pointless. We're not going to track savings. We're going to look at tracking other ways that we have impact on the P&L. And then for Kristine, it was savings is very important to us as a business because of the business we're in, because of the margins of the business that we're in. But nobody trusted the savings that we'd present because they're not real savings until they're real savings. So then her perspective was, how do I actually go and track real life savings to the P&L so that when savings are used as a measure, they can be trusted.
And Phil, if I may, in the off chance that some of our listeners might misinterpret you, let's be clear. It's not as though Thomas and his team at Bayer said, let's scrap the pursuit of spend reduction.
Right.
Let's stop trying to optimize costs. Let's be very clear about what he and what you mean now when you're repeating what he said on the show. He meant let's scrap the term savings as it has been dysfunctionally defined by procurement or handed to procurement in many cases. In other words, the definition of savings that includes, for example, A, projection of what should happen upon the signing of a contract, B, a limitation of said projection to the next 12 months, but nothing beyond it, and other dysfunctional elements as well. Now, of course, his team still pursues spend reduction.
Right.
Of course, his team still pursues cost containment. And guess what? That all manifests in the actual P&L, in the performance of the business. And Thomas said, I think along the way, I'm paraphrasing here, but I believe he says, when you run your business on actuals, you don't need to project anything. It's staring you in the face. There's no savings. There's just costs. If the costs go down, that's good. The business performs better. And I thought he said something that was really, and it was probably near and dear to your heart, Phil, as a football, or as I would used to call it, soccer. I've actually come around.
Yeah,
Just
you're not allowed to use that term in
Premier
here.
League football. That we know what we're speaking of. Maybe someday I'll even just say I'm going to watch the American football game on Sunday. I'm going to turn on the Bears.
Yep.
I'm not quite there yet, but Thomas said, we used to use this construct savings that existed outside of everything else that was happening at the business. It was just like good for our department only. But he said this move in the direction we've gone since scrapping savings and focusing on what really matters, value to the business, has put us on the pitch with our teammates in ways that have made us more aligned with the rest of the business. I got to think that resonated with you.
100%. I mean, we've taught for a long time on art of procurement. A lot of the things we've done around this, the business partnering and alignment with business objectives. And that's definitely something that we want to kind of pursue as we go through the remainder of the episodes within the series, is that connection with what the business cares about versus measuring, and I use the word measuring loosely, something to demonstrate, to almost, because we're not confident in the value we bring to the rest of the business, we're using something to try and give that helps us have confidence in what we're doing, even if the business might not have confidence in what those numbers are. And it feels like that's kind of what both Thomas and Kristine are trying to go away from, is that it has to be real. How do we measure something that's real and having real impact?
Kelly, if I could throw a question at you, thinking back in your time as a practitioner, share with the audience a little bit about, it's really a feelings question in a way, like, if you had to draw a point on a spectrum from 0 to 100, of 0 being I felt totally detached and kind of divorced from the rest of my team, to 100 being ideally aligned, in perfect harmony. And I guess it can be both a question for you personally, but your anecdotal observation in the hundreds, if not thousands, of procurement professionals that you've talked to through the years. Where do you think the average person in the profession's experience is in terms of the extent to which they feel aligned as teammates out there on the pitch, playing the same game that everybody else is playing with their teammates? Is it closer to 0, totally detached and divorced? Is it closer to 100, absolutely in lockstep?
And first, I'm just going to have to ask a follow-up question. Phil's going to be so disappointed in me. Pitch is something you do from the mound in baseball. So just clarifying, this is about
being on the field.
This is about procurement feeling aligned with other members of the business, so like cross-functional colleagues.
No, it was really just actually residing on the top of a rapidly spinning baseball as it projects 60 feet 6 inches towards home plate and curves along the way. It's a hell of a trick to stay on top. But you're on the pitch when you're doing that. It's not easy, but it's an amazing skill for only very small animals. Yes, Kelly.
And taking this back to procurement, clearly I'm not qualified for an overnight UFO sightings or sports talk radio. So in procurement terminology, can you just clarify, Rich, the question you're asking?
In procurement terminology, the question is, at one end of the spectrum, we have the desired state of, at 100, being, I have always felt, and I think the average procurement professional feels, very much a part of the team whose goals and objectives are very much aligned with the rest of the team, pulling in the same direction, not at odds with the other areas of the business. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have the opposite of that, kind of separate, divorced from the goals and objectives of the rest. And if you had to put a data point, like if you said, oh, about half and half, well, that's 50, of course. But yeah, and I'm asking both about your personal experience. If you think back, and maybe it was varied. In one role, it was really much, towards the positive end of the spectrum. In another, it was less so. And then just your observations of the people you've talked to within the procurement function. Where do you think the profession, resides on that spectrum as a general rule?
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for that. I want to make sure I'm answering the right question. So I actually am thinking about two past roles that come into mind. And I had opportunities to see, I think, both ends of the spectrum between the two roles. So I know I've shared in the past as part of this series that I worked for grocery retail, right? And I talked from a safety standpoint about if you're buying the fixtures that go in produce, you make sure that, that lone grape doesn't fall onto the floor, become a safety hazard and a lawsuit and all the things that go with it. I think when you work in a business, and whether you're managing direct or indirect spend, the closer that spend is related to the customer, to the operation of the business, the easier it is to feel fully aligned. So for instance, here's another example. I'm here in the Boston area. The chain of supermarkets that I worked for actually had a location on Martha's Vineyard, so on the other side of the Sound. In the winter, sometimes it gets cold enough that they actually can't get boats full of groceries over. It doesn't matter what your role was in that entire company. You held your breath until you heard that the ice had broken and the ships had gotten through, because that is how the people on the island of Martha's Vineyard were eating over the winter, right? And so you can't work in a company like that and manage categories of spend that put things into contact with your customers and not feel completely aligned with the idea of wanting to source everything, buy everything, manage every contact and supplier relationship in a way that goes far beyond savings in terms of value. But I've also worked in companies where you have somebody, so very large LTL logistics provider. You've got someone who's responsible for managing fuel. That category buyer is 100% integrated with the heartbeat of the business. The uniforms person, right up your alley, Rich, completely integrated with everything that motivates the business. But as you start to back away on, I guess, another continuum towards something like office supplies or facility cleaning, something that's a little bit more abstract in terms of its connection between the contract and the provider and the company's ability to operate, it gets harder to have that same sort of feeling. Now, one of the great things I think we've seen in procurement, and it doesn't necessarily work for everybody, is this idea that you can be a process expert versus a category expert. Certainly, that expertise has to reside within the business or within a third-party expert that you work for to make sure you're doing a good job managing that product or service category. But the benefit of working across categories that I think is sort of like the offset of that is that if you do work with a category that's sort of abstract in its connection to operational effectiveness, but you're also managing something like fuel, like uniforms, like something that's going to keep a customer safe in your store, you kind of keep that feeling with you. And I think it makes it that much easier to apply to the categories that don't have as obvious of a connection. So what I would say to you around that continuum is that one of the things procurement needs to strive for is finding a way to create that connection for themselves, even when the structure of the team and the category of the spend being managed don't naturally lend themselves to it. That's something we have to preserve through conversations with suppliers, conversations with business decision makers, when we can, conversations with consumers. And that could be consumers of a category inside the business. It could be consumers walking into that grocery store to buy those grapes, right? What is their experience? I think we have to keep ourselves fully understanding, sure, metrics, yes, process, maybe frameworks, but if we can't articulate that connection, right? If we can't internalize the way that it needs to work, it's going to be unbelievably different to carry that out in the recommendations that we make, the analysis that we do. and even conversations with all of the different people involved in that project. So that's how I would look at that continuum. I think any given person is probably managing projects, maybe at the same time, that are at different locations on that, and finding those transferable associations ultimately becomes a determination of whether you're truly strategic procurement or whether you're just doing the absolutely necessary blocking and tackling of operational procurement, but maybe without that bigger picture understanding.
Phil, I want to come to you and get your thoughts on this topic. And as I throw it to you, I want to just, it occurs to me that we would never even ask this question of a CFO.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you wouldn't need to.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, no, of course I'm aligned with the business's interests. This is, I reside atop the money part of the business, and that's pretty damn directly aligned to the business's interests. React to the question, if you would, and also what Kelly just shared.
Well, one thing I would say is that I think sometimes we put the blinkers on and we look at everything through a procurement lens. And I think that you may go and talk to some people, maybe not the CFO, but folks who work in finance. You definitely talk to some CIOs. You'll definitely talk to some chief HR officers, and they'll all say exactly the same thing, how disconnected they feel with the business, and that we've built this operating model design around silos that everyone feels in some way, shape, or form. But because we work in procurement, we just feel it and think, well, this is something that is specific to procurement. You look at survey data across different organizational functions, and they say similar things in terms of business alignment and business partnering, and that being where we need to focus and different business functions need to focus. So I don't necessarily think it's a procurement thing on its own. When you were asking the question to Kelly, kind of the thing that I wrote down that I thought of is that it's incredibly hard to build an organizational structure where everybody, by nature of the structure itself, feels connected to the business and what the true needs of the business are. And we facilitate workshops with companies to better understand what does the chief strategy officer need from a procurement organization, because guess what? It's not savings. It could be that we're trying to do M&A and we look at, you can be a scout for us to go and find people in the market that we could go and buy. And that's nothing to do with savings, but that has more strategic impact. I think though, individuals or some individuals do feel that impact, that connection to the business, but that's a very individually motivated thing. I think about you kind of pushing yourself to be connected with the needs of the business and focused on the needs of the business, and be comfortable that if you do that, then savings will end up following anyway. But because we're so focused on these savings in a lot of organizations, then that's truly what, the whole incentives we've talked about, that's the direction we go. And it's not necessarily, well, what does the business need from me? It's what can I use the business so that I can achieve what I need to achieve.
Well, and this brings us to Jason Busch's argument that we discussed a little bit in the last episode around the most appropriate metric being EBITDA. And if we were to move to this world that Jason envisions, this healthier state where that is the key metric that drives the activities of procurement, I have to think it would move the needle in the desired direction of feeling more aligned with the rest of the team, wherever people reside. And I think Kelly's point is well taken. When you worked in the grocery environment that you spoke of, Kelly, and in Martha's Vineyard, where there was this urgency, this kind of it was a bit of a mission, right? There's a mission to get the food to these people because people need food, and there's a challenge in getting it to them because of the weather. I mean, of course, that's going to align you more acutely with your team members than most people experience in their day-to-day work. I do think that's a bit of an outlier. From my anecdotal observation, it's not all. It doesn't tend to be that way.
No, I think it's hard in a services when you're responsible for services. It's easier when you're responsible in direct materials for widgets or for materials and things. And speaking, I started in the automotive business. I felt totally connected because I could see driving around the streets, the impact of the work that I did. So you feel really connected to it.
Yeah.
But when you're working on services and services kind of go into the ether of, they used to do something, but you don't necessarily see that. I think it's a lot harder if you feel connected with what the business needs.
But do we all agree? I think we do, but I just want to say it out loud before we kind of turn for home a little bit here. If the metric, the driving metric above all others, and I'm not saying the only one, but if the one metric that we all agreed was most driving procurement's value, or activities, was EBITDA, and I'm open to, and we'll explore this in the coming episodes, some definition of the term value where the definition entailed EBITDA. In other words, i.e., cost, the portion of procurement's efforts that actually manifests in the P&L and sticks, thereby restraining cost escalations, thereby reducing costs where possible, reducing spend, optimizing spend so that the business makes more profit. That would, I think, have the effect of increasing this feeling of being on the pitch with your teammates, wouldn't it? I have to think it would.
Yeah, I think that cost isn't the only way that we can impact EBITDA.
That's why I said value.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%, because I think there's more to that definition, and I think that's going to be a huge part of the plan we put out at the end of this project. It's the what else belongs in there, but it's a big part. Don't
I think what we know that savings is mostly here to stay, and so the question is, how can we be more effective at measuring that impact on EBITDA and in a way that is respected? And one of the things that came out of the Jason conversation was when we're talking about, are we going to be able to use agentic AI to farm information and data in a way that is just not scalable with people, so we can actually very quickly get real-time information around what has hit the bottom line versus here's a projection that's never really audited that falls kind of on deaf ears when a CFO looks at the end of the year because they don't see the impact on EBITDA. So I'm interested in kind of the thread of, okay, how can we use technology to make sure that one thing that most of us will be continue to be measured on is as real-time and accurate and reflects reality as possible. And then that gives permission for us to focus on some of those other value levers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelly, before we turn our attention to what's next, I want to give you the opportunity to close the loop on the all that we've discussed about recent episodes.
And thank you. As I'm sitting here listening to you, please don't let it be a sports question. Please don't let it be a sports question. So I'm in luck.
Especially
I think
not some psychedelic
a
sports question about being on top of a baseball hurtling through the air. Yeah, no, we're not.
It somehow has
anymore.
something to do with soccer. You want to talk NASCAR? You let me know. We'll do some analogies next time to NASCAR. I can talk that all day long. Football and all that. I'm not so great. So I think what I would say is we've spent a lot of time digging into the challenges. We've then, after those challenges were profiled, spent quite a bit of time understanding their implications, how they came to be. And then I guess back to my point about common sense, I love the fact that there are all of these new approaches and individuals with different backgrounds continuing to come into procurement. That's something that has fortunately not changed, right? We have a super diverse set of academic and professional backgrounds coming into the field. There are lots of different ways to solve for this. And so it's going to be incredibly interesting as we take these last few episodes to start digging into incentives, digging into what those alternatives are to replace what we're doing now that isn't working so great with something so much better. I think starting to lay that out is going to be a really fascinating process that I absolutely know people are not going to want to miss, but that I'm sure people will also have reflections on and input into as well.
And along those lines, in the very next episode that you will hear, we are going to speak, and we thought it was a good idea before we got, just dove into the specifics of building this future state plan. We thought it was worth hitting the pause button for a moment and thinking and talking about incentives broadly. And to that end, we have invited into the conversation an incentives guru. His name's Jason Brown. He's an accounting professor at Indiana University who has spent much of his career both in consulting and private sector work and then in academia, focused on the topic of corporate incentives. And I think Jason's going to have some fascinating insights for us that can help get our heads in the game of building healthy incentive structures, what some of the common pitfalls are, what are the mistakes that businesses make as they attempt to promote desired outcomes with the use of incentives. And I'm really excited to welcome Jason, a fellow Hoosier, into the conversation. I think it's going to be great. Phil,
Yeah.
any final thoughts before we close this this wackiest of perhaps all, by the way, episodes, and I don't even know, maybe even the wackiest of all Art of Procurement episodes
Can I
of
put it
all
in
time?
Football terms again.
Oh yeah,
No.
this.
What if you want me to understand it?
No. No, I mean, for me, I think that, as we've gone through this series, we've obviously explored possible areas of value and how we can go beyond savings. We've explored savings itself and ways that we can perhaps do a more effective job of measuring the impact of savings on the bottom line, on EBITDA, ultimately. And so now it's time to look at, okay, what do we do about all this? And so that's, as you mentioned, the next episode with Jason is really to start thinking about, okay, how do we start thinking about building incentive structures that work? How do we start to overcome some of those silos where incentives are based on procurement has their own incentives, HR has their own incentives, finance has their own incentives, so that we're working across the organization, because then that allows us to then start digging into, for the final, 5 episodes of the series, what are we going to do about this?
Crap, we've only got 5 episodes left. There's a lot of work to do. Well, thank you, Phil. Or I'm going to say this a little differently. Muchas gracias, Phil. Muchas gracias, Kelly. And to all of our listeners, hasta luego. Thank you for joining us
Thanks,
on
everybody.
By the Way.